everybody. Welcome to Scoping a Common Agenda. This is the first webinar in a webinar series for engaging underrepresented youth. This is a collective impact webinar series, and I'm your host, Liz Weaver, co-CEO of Tamarack. The Engaging Underrepresented Youth Collective Impact webinar series is sponsored by the Employment and Social Development Canada Learning Branch and the Tamarack Institute. We want to first begin by introducing you to the Tamarack Institute. The Tamarack Institute is comprised of two distinct parts. We have our Tamarack Learning Center, and our Learning Center really supports learners in 5 interconnected practices that we believe leads to kind of impactful community change. And the practices are collective impact. This series is about collective impact, community engagement, collaborative leadership, community innovation, and evaluating impact. So if you're a learner, you want to build your skills in each of these 5 areas. The next area that we work in at Tamarack is vibrant communities. And in that area, we focus on cities reducing poverty and cities deepening community. And we have a network of cities across Canada and the United States that are working at the local level to reduce poverty and to connect neighbors together. That's Tamarack, and you find out more about our tools and resources at www.tamarackcommunity.ca. This webinar, we have a number of goals. The first goal is to review the collective impact framework. Next, we're going to focus in on the specific condition of collective impact called building a common agenda or scoping a common agenda. And then we're going to introduce you to some tools and some approaches that will help you scope your common agenda and your strategy for change. So let's begin. What is collective impact? Well, the folks at FSG, Foundation Strategy Group, and the Collective Impact Forum define collective impact as a disciplined cross-sector approach to solving complex social and environmental issues at scale. And so when we're thinking about underrepresented youth, we know that the journey of underrepresented youth is varied. Many of them have different paths that they take. Some of them don't complete post-secondary education. Some of them don't connect to employment. So it becomes a complex issue, and we need a cross-sector approach. So collective impact is really best suited to these kinds of problems. In the collective impact framework, there are 3 preconditions, and you want to really focus on these before you dive into the framework. The first is influential champions. And so when we think about influential champions, we think about, do we have the right people at the table? Do we have champions who are able to move the needle on this issue? Whether it's the perspective of youth at the table or the business community or education leaders, those are the kinds of champions that we want to engage in this work. The second precondition that we want to focus on is urgency of the issue. So is the issue of underrepresented youth an urgent and important issue? In some communities where youth are not graduating from high school, it is a very urgent and important issue, and we want to see better outcomes for those youth. And so urgency is the second precondition. And then finally, the third precondition of collective impact is around adequate resources. And this really speaks to understanding that that collective impact problem solving is about long-term change, and that we really need to have enough resources, both human and financial resources, to be able to help this change to occur systematically in our communities. So those are the preconditions of collective impact. Now we'll move on to the 5 core conditions of collective impact. And this is really the essence of the framework. So the core conditions are developing a common agenda. And this is where we see that the folks that are gathered around the collective impact table have a shared vision for change, and they also understand the problem. They understand it from both a data perspective, who is being impacted most directly by the problem, but they also understand it from a story perspective. So what are the stories that people are telling us about the problem and how it plays out in the community that we're trying to solve the problem for? And so those are kind of core elements of a common agenda. In future webinars as part of this series, we're going to focus on shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, and then the final webinar will be around continuous communications and backbone support. So this series will take into focus all 5 conditions of collective impact. But for this webinar, we're going to really focus on the common agenda condition of collective impact. So how do we scope a common agenda? So we've already talked about a common agenda being a shared vision for the change that we want to see in our communities. And so we want to figure out, okay, how can we have good conversations with those influential champions in a way that leads us towards a strong and impactful common agenda. There are some core elements to scoping a common agenda. And these 5 elements come from some work that the Collective Impact Forum has done around really thinking through the common agenda. And so the first element, when we're working together as a diverse team of community leaders, we have to actually land on some guiding principles. So these are really the values that will guide our group in making decisions. And that's almost the first bit of work that we do when we're scoping a common agenda. Part of it is also thinking about, okay, what's the common definition of the problem that we're trying to solve? And this is the next item in terms of the common agenda elements. We want to come to agreement by reviewing existing data about the problem, thinking about what the root causes are, and then really thinking about what are the boundaries that we want to put around this problem. Are there geographic boundaries? Are there demographic boundaries like age or target population? And we'll go into this a little bit more further on in the webinar. Finally, our third element is to identify a goal. So what is our measurable population level goal that will really demonstrate that we want to make progress on this issue? And if we're thinking about engaging underrepresented youth, and the problem in our community is that the youth in our community, a large percentage of them, 30% of them, are not graduating high school, then we might want to set a goal that in the next 5 years, we are going to increase the number of people that are, the number of youth that are graduating from high school by 5%. And so that may or may not seem realistic, but we want to set something that is realistic for our community, that measurable population level goal. The fourth element is to develop a framework for change. And this is really understanding who's going to drive the work forward. Are we going to have a steering committee? Are we going to set up working groups? How is this work going to unfold? This kind of common agenda work and the strategies that we identify coming out of the common agenda. And then finally, the final element is really looking at developing a plan for learning. One of the things that we've learned at Tamarack in terms of supporting communities through the collective impact process is that things will occur during the course of your planning that you may not have been able to anticipate. And so a plan for learning really means that you can not only observe progress as it's happening, you can figure out how to track it, but let's say an opportunity comes forward, you can figure out, okay, so is it time for us to pause now, reflect on what just happened, and then integrate better practices into our process as we go. And that's really what a plan for learning is all about. The first element that we talked about was setting up some guiding principles about how this work, how we're going to work together. And so guiding principles are really about our shared values. So if you bring a group of influential champions together and you have, you know, business leaders and you have educators and you have people from nonprofit or community-based organizations around the table and you have youth, those folks may not have necessarily worked together on a collaborative project. And so you want to set out the rules of engagement. And you want to consider what are some of the things that are unique about our community that if we're working collaboratively together for the next couple of years on this initiative, how will we draw those best practices into our work? So what we've provided for you here on this slide is the guiding principles that were developed by the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. And so the Hamilton Roundtable is a collective impact initiative based in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And they're really trying to move the needle on poverty in their community. And so here are the way that they have framed their guiding principles of how they're going to work together. And the first one really says, okay, we're not focusing on poor that are better off. In fact, what our work is all about is the net decline of the number of people who are poor in our community. So it's really trying to focus on seeing a net decline. They want to tackle the root causes of poverty. They want to work collaboratively across sectors. And I think the fourth principle is a really interesting one. They say that they will abandon blame, recognizing that all people can be part of the solution. And you know, when you think about an issue like poverty, there's lots of blame that does go around. And so how can they mitigate that? Well, they've put it in their guiding principles. And so this is just an example. We're not suggesting that you take these guiding principles. What we want you to do is have an example that you can, you know, think about and then look to your own community and say, okay, so if we're working together around this table, what would be important for us if we're trying to move the needle for underrepresented youth in our community? The second element of scoping a common agenda is really trying to identify the boundaries that will be important to you in terms of identifying the common agenda. And so here are some boundaries to consider. What's the geographic scope of the work? Is it a region? Is it a city? Is it a community? Is it focused on specific neighborhoods? The second thing to consider is what's the population focus? If you're working with underrepresented youth, is it youth from 15 to 25 or youth from 12 to 30? So what's the specific population or demographic focus? Are you going to work on systems change, policy change, or environmental change? What's the focus that you want to consider in that area? Do you have data that informs the work? And are there already current indicators that you can draw upon that will help you kind of focus your work and will be important in terms of scoping the common agenda? Are there opportunities for quick wins? And then always, are there other boundaries that are specific to your community that you need to consider? These are just some high-level boundaries, and you might add some specific boundaries for your community to this list. In setting your goal for change, you want to use a population goal that can really be measured. And I gave you an example a couple of minutes ago about, you know, increasing high school graduation rates. So that's a fairly easy goal to identify. There's usually data that is collected about that goal. There might be some other population level goals that are a little bit harder to measure. Some other things to consider are that your goal should be inspiring. It should make you want to reach beyond what is normally achievable. And you also want to consider issues of equity. So are, you know, certain populations or subpopulations in your community, are they more challenged by this issue of high school graduation or engaging underrepresented youth than other demographics or other populations within your community? So here's an example. This is the Seattle Roadmap Project out of Seattle, Washington. Their common agenda goal is to double the number of students in South King County and South Seattle who are on track to graduate from college or earn a career credential by 2020. And so what this goal says is that they need a baseline, right? They need to know what are how many students currently are on track in terms of these two geographic communities, South King County and South Seattle, how many are currently on track, and then how many do they want to get to in order to double that number. So I think it's a really interesting way of framing their common agenda. And I love the second sentence in this example, which is we are committed to nothing less than closing the unacceptable achievement gaps for low-income students and children of color and increasing achievement for all students from cradle to college to career. And so you can see by that second statement that it is audacious and it is inspiring. So you might want to think about those components when you're scoping and setting the goal for change for your collective impact work. Your framework for change really identifies and prioritizes a set of strategies that you want to work on. So not only do we have this audacious goal, but we also then want to say, okay, what are the 3 or 4 strategies, 3 to 5 strategies that we might use or we might develop as our initial strategies? And then how do we build action teams and working groups to take on those specific strategies? And so that's almost, those are the elements of the framework for change that you want to put into place. And then finally, the final component is the learning and evaluation plan. And so this is, it's not enough just to set your common agenda, but this is where the next condition of collective impact, that of shared measurement, comes into play, right? So as you're making progress towards your common agenda, you want to always be asking the questions, what are we learning? What's important to pay attention to right now? What are some of the trends that we're seeing in our community that we might be able to leverage, or ones that we have to really pay attention to? And then the final question is, how do we incorporate our learning into our current work? And we think that the best collective impact initiatives that we've observed are those that are always kind of not only doing the work, but then looking out to kind of the broader system, the broader ecosystem, and saying, what are the trends? Where are the opportunities? How can we, you know, move this initiative forward in a way that leverages some of these trends and some of these opportunities that we see in our community? So that's the learning and evaluation plan. So those are the kind of core elements in terms of scoping your common agenda. We've got a couple of tools for you that might be helpful to your group when you're thinking about scoping a common agenda in terms of your collective impact approach. And the first is a collective impact feasibility framework. This again comes from our colleagues at the Collective Impact Forum. And this is really kind of a helpful way of flow charting the work and really determining, is collective impact the right framework for the change that you're envisioning in your community? And so it asks you in the first case, in the first step, to identify the specific social program that you want to work on from your community context. And you know, the program wants to be, the specific social problem wants to be big enough that you need people to come together and work collaboratively on it. It can't be those, it has to have the right size and the right scope. It can't be too small that, you know, one organization can do it on its own. It really is something that requires different people with different skills and different perspectives to really kind of focus on. So the more specific you can be on the social problem, the easier it is to navigate your way through the feasibility framework. The second step in the feasibility framework is to look at who are the actors in the system. And this is to some degree pulling in that notion of influential champions that we talked about in the preconditions of collective impact. And so who are the actors and how do they influence the system? And so if you're thinking about the problem of underrepresented youth, you want to map the actors in the system. And it might be youth themselves, both youth that are represented and also underrepresented youth. You might want to think about business leaders. You might want to think about the education system. You might want to think about supporting organizations in the community that are engaged with youth. So you want to spend some time mapping the system. And then you want to ask, is collective impact the most appropriate solution for solving this problem? And then the final step is, if yes, we think collective impact is the right approach, then is our community ready for cross-sector collaboration? So this flow chart, this feasibility framework, is actually quite helpful in terms of both scoping the common agenda, but also helping you think through, is this the right framework for the change that you want to make? The next tool that we have is really about scoping the common agenda work and really having your group think about what's in and what's out. And so this draws on some of those boundaries that we talked about earlier in the presentation. So the boundaries could be the beneficiaries or the target population, geography, timeline. It also leads into activities and outcomes. And at the bottom, from all of this, you might want to then think about what's our impact statement, what's our common agenda. An intended impact statement is just another way of saying, you know, our common agenda, right? It's what's the impact, what's the change that we want to achieve together. And then finally, here's a strategy planning canvas that you can use to, again, scope your common agenda. There is a tool on the Tamarack website that brings you into the strategy planning canvas. What you want to do is put your issue in the middle. So we want to engage, increase our engagement of underrepresented youth, and we want to talk a little bit more, define that a little bit more, and then you work your way around the strategy planning canvas. You might look at community needs and assets. What are the results? Well, we want to increase the engagement of underrepresented youth by 5% in the next year. What are some potential strategies that we might employ to do that? It's also important to test your assumptions. So our assumptions are that youth want to be engaged, and maybe they do or maybe they don't. And if they don't, why is it that they don't want to be engaged? And what would that look like? And we also want to look at influential factors. We have an influential factor might be, we have a number of youth-serving organizations in our community already, and they're delivering lots of programs and services. And really what we need in order to better engage underrepresented youth is to help youth know that those programs and services exist. And so that might be an influential factor that will lead into a strategy of better communication or better mapping or better service delivery in our community. So Common Agenda Strategy Planning Canvas is a great tool for you to kind of think through your common agenda, see where there are points of synergy, but also see where there are points where you might run into some challenges, or you might have to do a little bit of a deeper dive into research in your community about, you know, programs and services that are going on, or trends that you're seeing, or particular hotspots that you need to, that your collective impact initiative needs to address. So those are 3 tools or 3 approaches that you can use in terms of scoping your common agenda. For more information and more collective impact resources, we ask you to visit tamarackcommunity.ca. This webinar and the whole webinar series will be posted on this website and will be available to you so that you can share it with your collective impact leadership team, and you can revisit it when you want to check out a certain idea or a certain tool and spend a little bit more time with it. We hope you've enjoyed this first in our webinar series for engaging underrepresented youth. Please come back and visit us again in the future. If you want to learn more about me, you can visit my profile on tamarackcommunity.ca, or you can email me at liz@tamarackcommunity.ca. Thank you for joining us on the Engaging Underrepresented Youth Collective Impact webinar series. This webinar is sponsored by Employment and Social Development Canada, the Learning Branch, and by the Tamarack Institute.